"I can't afford this date," she whispered, right as the waiter stood there waiting for payment. The restaurant wasn't expensive. She had ordered the cheapest thing on the menu, water instead of soda. No extras, but her card still declined. She felt the heat rush to her face as the waiter quietly explained what she already knew. She opened her wallet with shaking hands. $12. That was all she had left until next Friday. Across from her sat a single dad she actually liked. The kind who listened. The kind who smiled without checking his phone. This was supposed to be a simple first date. Not the moment her entire financial reality got exposed in public. Her chest tightened. Her voice dropped. "I'm so sorry. I really thought I had enough." She couldn't look at him. She was already bracing herself for the awkward goodbye. But instead of standing up, instead of making an excuse, instead of looking embarrassed for her, the single dad did something that made her realize this night wasn't a failure at all. It was the beginning of something she never saw coming. The silence at the table felt heavier than the bill itself. She kept her eyes fixed on the worn wooden surface, tracing the same scratch near the edge with her thumb, as if looking up might make the humiliation real in a way she couldn't survive. Her breathing had gone shallow. Every second stretched longer than it should have. She was already rehearsing what she'd say next. An apology. A joke to soften it. An excuse about forgetting her wallet. Anything to make this end. Across from her, the single dad didn't move right away. That pause, those few quiet seconds, terrified her more than if he had stood up instantly. In her mind, she pictured it clearly. The polite smile. The awkward chair scrape. The rushed goodbye followed by silence that would last forever. She had ruined it. Not because she wasn't interesting. Not because she wasn't kind. But because she was broke. Then she heard him exhale. Not a sigh of frustration. Not annoyance. Just a slow, steady breath. "Hey," he said gently, his voice low enough that the waiter couldn't hear. "It's okay." She shook her head immediately, words spilling out too fast. "No, it's really not. I swear I thought I had enough. My rent went through this morning, and I should have checked first. I'm so embarrassed." Her cheeks burned. She could feel tears pushing forward, the kind that come when your body gives up trying to stay composed. He didn't interrupt her. Instead, he reached for his wallet. The movement startled her. "No," she said quickly, panic cutting through her voice. "You don't have to do that. We said we'd split it." "I know," he replied calmly. "And we will. Just not tonight." He handed his card to the waiter without hesitation. The transaction took seconds. The receipt printed. The crisis, at least on the surface, was over. But inside her chest, everything was still unraveling. "I hate this," she whispered once the waiter walked away. "I hate that this is how you'll remember me." That made him look up sharply. "Remember you?" he repeated. "As what?" She swallowed. "As the girl who couldn't even afford dinner." He leaned back slightly, studying her face, not with judgment, but with something closer to recognition. "Can I tell you something?" he asked. She nodded, wiping her cheeks quickly. "Last year," he said, "I stood in a grocery store holding a basket of food for my kids while my card declined 3 times in a row. People were waiting. My daughters were asking why we weren't leaving. I had to put things back. Cereal, fruit, stuff they needed." Her breath caught. "I went home that night and cried in my car because I felt like I was failing them," he continued. "So no, I don't see you as someone who can't afford dinner. I see someone who's trying." The tension in her shoulders finally cracked. They paid the rest and stepped outside into the cool night air. The street was quieter than the restaurant, lit by old street lamps that hummed faintly. Without really deciding it, they walked a few steps down and sat on a wooden bench near the corner. Neither of them spoke at first. Then she said, "I almost didn't come tonight." "Why?" he asked. "Because I was afraid this would happen," she admitted. "That money would show up before I could hide it." He gave a small, knowing smile. "Funny. I almost canceled too." That surprised her. "Why?" "Because I wasn't sure I had the energy to pretend I had everything together." They looked at each other then. Really looked. And in that quiet space between them, something shifted. The date hadn't gone wrong. It had gone honest. And neither of them was ready to admit it yet. But this wasn't the end of the night. It was the beginning of the part that actually mattered. They didn't call it a second date. They just started meeting. Sometimes it was a walk after work. Sometimes a bench in the park with coffee bought from the cheapest place nearby. No reservations. No pressure. And no pretending. For the first time in her life, She didn't feel the need to calculate every sentence before saying it. She didn't have to laugh louder to seem more fun, or dress nicer to seem more put together. He already knew where she stood, financially, emotionally, all of it. That should have made her feel lighter. Instead, it made her afraid. Because now she had something to lose. She noticed it in the small moments. The way she hesitated before suggesting they meet, afraid he'd think she was asking for something she couldn't afford. The way she checked prices automatically, even when he hadn't mentioned money at all. The way she replayed that night at the restaurant in her head, wondering if he'd eventually regret staying. Across town, he was fighting his own quiet battles. Mornings started before sunrise. Packing lunches, tying shoes, answering questions he didn't always have energy for. By the time he dropped his kids off, his phone was already buzzing with reminders he didn't want to look at. Deadlines. Invoices. Numbers that never quite lined up. He told himself it was temporary, that it would stabilize, that he just needed one decent break. But the truth sat heavier every day. One client pulled out. Then another delayed payment. Then an email he'd been avoiding finally arrived. We need to pause the project indefinitely. He stared at the screen longer than he should have. This was the part he didn't tell her. Not because he didn't trust her, but because he didn't want to become another weight she had to carry. She already worried enough. He could see it in the way she flinched when prices came up, or apologized for things that didn't need apologies. So he did what he'd always done. He minimized. He delayed. He said, "Work's just been busy." And slowly, without meaning to, he started pulling back. Texts came later. Plans became tentative. Meetings turned into rain checks. She noticed immediately. At first, she told herself she was overthinking. People got busy. Life happened. She didn't want to be that person who panicked the moment something shifted. But the silence grew. 2 days without a real conversation. Then 3. Then a canceled plan that had already been rescheduled once. Her chest tightened in a way she recognized too well. She had been here before. She told herself it wasn't about money, that she wasn't projecting her own insecurities onto him. But late at night, lying on her bed staring at the ceiling, the same thought kept circling. Maybe he'd realized what she couldn't give. Maybe kindness wasn't enough. Maybe eventually, everyone wanted someone easier. She started holding back too. Shorter replies. Less enthusiasm. Excuses about being tired when he suggested seeing each other. Neither of them said it out loud, but they were both doing the same thing. Protecting themselves by retreating. The breaking point didn't come with shouting or drama. It came on a quiet Tuesday night. She was sitting at her small kitchen table, unpaid bills spread out in front of her, phone face down beside them. She had been staring at it for nearly an hour, debating whether to say something or keep pretending everything was fine. Finally, she picked it up. "If you're done, just tell me," she typed. Then erased it. That sounded desperate. She tried again. "Did I do something wrong?" Erase. Her fingers hovered over the screen, shaking slightly. She was tired of guessing. Tired of wondering. Tired of feeling like she was bracing for disappointment every time her phone lit up. So she grabbed her keys instead. He was surprised when he opened the door and saw her standing there. Not angry. Not crying. Just exhausted. "I need you to be honest with me," she said before he could speak. "Because I can't do this guessing thing anymore." He felt it then, the moment he'd been avoiding. This wasn't about a missed text or a canceled plan. This was about everything they hadn't said. He stepped aside and let her in. And as the door closed behind them, both of them knew something was about to change, one way or another. Because whatever happened next, there would be no more hiding. And honesty, once it starts, has a way of tearing everything open. Right here is where most people disappear. Not because they stop caring, but because staying feels riskier than leaving. She could walk away tonight and never feel this exposed again. Or she could stay, hear the truth, and risk being hurt for real. If you've ever been in that moment, type stay or walk in the comments. No explanations, just the choice. Because what she does next will change everything. He didn't invite her to sit down, not because he didn't want her there, but because part of him knew that once they did, there would be no easy way out. She stood just inside the doorway, arms crossed, keys still clenched in her hand like a shield. The room smelled faintly of coffee and something reheated too many times. It was quiet in a way that made every word feel heavier before it was even spoken. "I'm not here to fight," she said first, her voice steady but thin. "I just need to know what's going on." He nodded slowly, rubbing a hand over his face. I know, he said, and I'm sorry you had to come here to get answers. That hurt more than she expected. So why didn't you tell me? She asked. Why did you just disappear? He looked at her then. Really looked. Not the version of her from that first date. Hopeful, nervous, trying. But this version. The one standing in front of him now, tired of guessing. I didn't disappear, he said quietly. I just didn't want to bring you into something messy. Her jaw tightened. You don't get to decide that for me. The words hung between them. He opened his mouth to respond, then closed it again. For a moment, it looked like he might retreat, smooth it over, minimize it, do what he always did. Instead, he stepped back. Okay, he said. You're right. That surprised both of them. He ran a hand through his hair and exhaled slowly, like he was bracing himself for impact. My work is falling apart, he admitted. Not busy. Not stressful. Falling apart. She didn't interrupt. I lost my biggest client, he continued. The one keeping everything afloat. Payments stopped. Projects paused. And I don't know if I can keep the business running. There it was. The thing he'd been hiding behind polite distance and half-truths. I wake up every morning calculating how long I can keep pretending everything's fine, he said. How many weeks before I have to start making calls I don't want to make? Her chest tightened. And you thought pulling away was better than telling me? She asked. He swallowed. I thought if you saw how unstable my life actually is, you'd walk away. Silence. Then she laughed. Not because it was funny, but because something inside her finally snapped. You were afraid I'd leave, she said, shaking her head. Because of money. He nodded once. She took a step closer. Do you know what I've been thinking these past 2 weeks? She asked. I thought you were pulling away because you realized I wasn't worth the trouble. Because I couldn't afford dinner. Because I don't bring anything impressive to the table. His head snapped up. That's not. Let me finish, she cut in, her voice breaking despite her effort to keep it together. I already walk around feeling like I'm one bad week away from falling apart. Like I'm constantly apologizing for existing. And when you stopped showing up, it felt like confirmation. He looked stunned. I didn't know, he said softly. I know, she replied. Because you didn't ask. The weight of it all settled at once. 2 people standing in the same room. Both carrying the same fear. Both convinced they were the weaker one. She wiped at her eyes, frustrated with herself. I don't need someone rich, she said. I don't need someone who has it all figured out. I need someone who tells me the truth instead of disappearing when things get hard. He took a step toward her. I was trying to protect you, he said. She shook her head. No, you were protecting yourself. That one landed. He leaned against the counter, suddenly looking older, more tired than she'd ever seen him. I've spent so long being the one who holds everything together, he admitted. For my kids. For work. For everyone. I don't know how to let someone see me fail. Her voice softened. You're not failing. You're struggling. There's a difference. They stood there, neither reaching for the other, both afraid that if they did, the dam would break completely. Finally, he spoke again. I don't know how this ends, he said. I can't promise stability. Or easy. Or anything impressive. She met his gaze. I can't promise I won't get scared, she said. Or insecure. Or overwhelmed. Then she took a breath. But I can promise I won't walk away just because things are hard. He let out a shaky laugh. That's more than fair. For the first time since she'd walked in, the tension in the room shifted. Not gone, but transformed. No longer sharp. Just heavy with truth. They sat down then. Not because everything was fixed, but because there was nothing left to hide. And in that honesty, raw and uncomfortable as it was, something real finally had room to exist. They didn't know it yet, but this wasn't the moment their problems ended. It was the moment they stopped facing them alone. Nothing changed overnight. There was no dramatic turnaround. No sudden win. No phone call that fixed everything. But something inside them did. They started telling the truth sooner. Not the polished kind. The kind you share when you're already tired and don't have the energy to pretend anymore. He told her when work felt overwhelming instead of waiting until it spilled into silence. She told him when her anxiety crept in instead of swallowing it and calling it fine. Some days were still heavy. Bills didn't disappear. Schedules didn't magically align. His business was still fragile. Her paycheck was still tight. But they stopped treating money like a personal failure and started treating it like a shared reality. They made quiet adjustments. Dinner at home instead of eating out. Groceries planned instead of guessed. Walks instead of dates that required reservations. And somehow, those things didn't feel like sacrifices. They felt intentional. On nights when the numbers didn't add up, they sat side by side at the kitchen table, papers spread out, phones calculator open. There was no blame, no frustration aimed at each other. Just the mutual understanding that this was what surviving together actually looked like. One afternoon, a small break came. Not life-changing, not headline-worthy. He landed a short-term contract, smaller than the clients he'd lost, but steady. Enough to stop the free fall. Enough to breathe. When he told her, he didn't celebrate. He just exhaled. "That helps," he said simply. She smiled, not because things were suddenly okay, but because for the first time in weeks, the future didn't feel like it was closing in. A week later, her own news came quietly. Her manager asked her to stay late one evening. She assumed the worst, replayed every possible mistake in her head as she walked into the office. But instead of a warning, she got an offer. A small raise. More consistent hours. It wasn't much, but it mattered. They didn't go out to celebrate. They cooked pasta at home, sat on the couch with mismatched plates and cheap wine, laughing at how different this moment felt compared to that first date. No embarrassment. No fear of being exposed. Just relief. There were still bad days. Days when his emails went unanswered. Days when her bank balance dipped lower than she liked to admit. But now, those days didn't feel like the end. They felt manageable. He started showing up again. Not perfectly, but honestly. She stopped holding back, stopped measuring her worth by what she could contribute financially. They were still careful, still budgeting, still choosing practicality over appearances. But something important had shifted. They weren't bracing anymore. They were building, slowly, quietly, without guarantees. One evening, as they cleaned up after dinner, she caught him watching her with that thoughtful expression he got when he was processing something bigger than words. "What?" she asked. He shook his head. "Just thinking about how different things feel now." "Better?" she asked. He considered it. "More real." She smiled. "I'll take that." They didn't know what the next year would bring. They didn't pretend stability was permanent. But for the first time, the uncertainty didn't scare them the way it used to. Because uncertainty was no longer something they faced alone. And that, quietly, made all the difference. The idea didn't come to him all at once. It started as a thought he pushed away, something impractical, poorly timed, irresponsible. He told himself to wait, to be smarter, to have more to offer. But the more he waited, the clearer it became. If he kept waiting for the right moment, he might miss the only one that actually mattered. So he chose a night that didn't look special at all. No reservations. No crowd. No plan that required spending money they didn't have. Just a quiet evening after dinner, the kind they'd grown used to. Dishes drying on the rack. The apartment lit by a single lamp in the corner. Her shoes by the door, always slightly crooked. She was on the couch, scrolling absent-mindedly, when he cleared his throat. "I've been thinking about something," he said. She looked up, sensing the shift in his voice. "That sounds dangerous." He smiled, nervous but steady. "Probably." He didn't kneel right away. He didn't make a speech. He just sat down across from her, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together like he was trying to hold himself in place. "I don't have a lot," he said. "And I'm not pretending that's going to change overnight." She stayed quiet. "But what I do have," he continued, "is the certainty that I don't want to face any of this without you." Her breath caught. "I can't promise comfort," he said, "or stability, or that things won't get hard again." Then he reached into his pocket. Not a box, not something shiny, just a small ring, simple and worn, resting in his palm. "It belonged to someone who believed that family mattered more than appearances," he said softly. "And I think she'd want it to mean something again." Her eyes filled instantly. He finally knelt then, not because it was dramatic, but because his legs didn't trust themselves to hold him upright. "I'm not asking you to marry a version of me that doesn't exist," he said. "I'm asking you to choose this life with me. The real one. The messy one." She didn't answer right away. Not because she was unsure, but because she needed a moment to breathe through the weight of it, through the quiet truth of what he was offering. Then she nodded. "Yes," she whispered. "I don't need more than this." When he slipped the ring onto her finger, it fit as if it had been waiting. They didn't celebrate loudly. They sat there for a long time, foreheads pressed together, laughing softly through tears. Not because everything was solved, but because they'd stopped pretending love was something you earned with money. Weeks later, Nothing about their lives looked different from the outside. They still budgeted, still checked balances before purchases, still chose practicality over polish. But inside, everything had shifted. They had chosen honesty over comfort, presence over pride, each other, without conditions. And if anyone asked how it all started, she never mentioned the ring. She always went back to that first night. The declined card, the whispered apology, the moment she thought it was over. Because that was when she learned something she'd carry forever. Sometimes the thing you're most ashamed of is the exact place where real love begins. I used to believe that love was something you had to earn, that you needed to show up polished, stable, with enough money in your account to prove you were worth choosing. I thought being broke meant being behind, that struggling meant I didn't have much to offer anyone. But that night taught me something I never learned when things were easy. When my card declined, I wasn't just embarrassed about money. I was afraid of being seen for who I really was, someone trying, but still falling short. And instead of walking away, he stayed. Not because he could fix things, not because he had more than I did, but because he understood. What I learned is this: the right person doesn't show up when your life looks impressive. They show up when it's honest. Being broke didn't make us weaker. Pretending we weren't struggling did. And choosing to face the hard parts together, that's what turned a bad night into the beginning of a real life. If this story reminded you that honesty matters more than appearances, that love isn't built on comfort, but on choosing each other when things aren't easy, then subscribe to this channel. We tell stories for people who are still figuring things out, and who believe that being real is worth more than being perfect.